So what's up, everybody? This is my very first episode, so welcome to the Adapted Lens. I'd like to do a special shout out to my only two fans, my wife and my mom. I am not sponsored by Squarespace, but call me. So a little bit about me. I kind of took a back road into photography. Most photographers start out as either smartphone photographers or they started out in the age of film. But for me, I started out in video. And so photography just sort of came naturally. When I talked to folks who were DSLR photographers and they still have a problem with the whole electronic viewfinder thing, I said, well, that's all there ever was in video. So I've never used anything but an electronic viewfinder. For me, learning an optical viewfinder was a weird experience. So I've been a photographer for about a decade now, and with that I've tried just about every piece of equipment out there, from Nikon and Canon and Sony. I've done just about everything from portrait photography to landscape photography and street photography. I actually started out this whole journey wanting to be the next Ansel Adams. That's hilarious when I live in Florida, nice and flat. About a year and a half into my photographic journey, I discovered wildlife photography. I was down a trail looking for a beautiful sunset, and I saw a bird, took a picture. It was sharp, surprisingly, and next thing you know, I was hooked. And so what does every wildlife photographer want? They want that big piece of sexy glass. Well, I had it. I went out and bought a 500mm f4.5. Yeah, 4.5. It's the old Canon L lens, still super sharp, but with no image stabilization. So it's a little hard to handhold. But yeah, you know, I went out and did it. But I didn't start out that way. For me, I started out with a standard from Best Buy 70 to 300mm kit lens and a D3100, Nikon D3100, about as entry level as you could possibly get. I think it had 14 megapixels at the time and a whopping 3 frames per second. Yeah, not exactly a sports monster or wildlife monster, but it was a good start. It taught me some fundamentals, and I learned things like the exposure triangle and all those important photographic rules that then we learn to break as we get better. But soon I wanted a little bit more, a little more reach, a little more speed, a little better autofocus, and that led me to my next camera, the D7000. Ah, the D7000. I took it with me to Alaska. I took it with me to the South Florida Keys. I really took that camera with me everywhere. And around my neck was the Sigma 50 to 500, also known as the Bigma. Not the second version with optical image stabilization. Nope, that first version, because that's all I could afford at the time. It was about a $500 lens, and that was a real stretch back then. I begged my wife for days before our trip down south and said, please, 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 all I need to be a great wildlife photographer is this lens. I need that reach, and I'll be right there on the cover of National Geographic. Well, still not there yet, but my wife did say yes, and I did receive my shiny, used Sigma in the mail just a few days later. I bolted that sucker onto my D7000 and off I went, on to find the next amazing wildlife picture. But I didn't know much at the time, so I carried my camera in a sling bag across the front of my chest, and I wore it around my neck when I was out hiking. Yeah, that big Sigma lens with that Nikon D7000 on my neck for hours at a time. Sure, I was in my mid-20s, but still, that's not the kind of abuse that your body should take ever. It wasn't long before I wanted even more. More reach, more speed, and full frame. That was such a key for me at the time. Gosh, I knew I wasn't going to be a great photographer unless I had a full frame camera. That was just the bee's knees for me. So I regrettably sold my D7000 and off I went to the store to buy a shiny new D610 with a whopping 5 frames per second, but full frame. That was it. I knew I was in the money. A few months later and I still hadn't gotten a call from National Geographic. What was it? It must have been that old 50-500 Sigma lens. It just wasn't sharp enough to get me the great pictures I needed. So off to the store I went and I came home with a brand new, at the time, cutting edge Tamron 150-600. That lens changed everything. For the first time, I was out at 600 millimeters in full frame terms with that beautiful background blur. And I knew at any moment I was going to be getting the call from National Geographic or Audubon saying, we need your pictures on the cover of our magazines. Some cars going by. So here I was with a full frame camera and a 150-600 lens, and I wasn't getting any calls. So I better look into what other piece of gear I might need. So I came to a birding festival right here in Merritt Island just a few months later, and I talked to some folks about what I would need to take the next step to be that great photographer. And they said, oh, you should get a gimbal head. That's just gonna make your lens so much easier to handle. That big 600 millimeters, oh, on a gimbal, it'll be a piece of cake. So I took what little money I had, scraped it together, traded in a head, and bought a gimbal head. So now I had it. The 600 millimeter lens, the full frame camera, the gimbal head on a carbon fiber tripod. Whoo! Any minute now I was gonna get that phone call, just begging me to come work for them. Alas, that call never came. But you know what? I didn't think it was me. It must be the frame rate my camera had. So I went out, sold everything I had, and I bought a Canon 7D Mark II with 10 frames per second. None of this 5 or 6 bull. Now I have 10 frames a second. I know I'm gonna get photographs that are gonna just wow the editors with 10 frames per second. So along with that 7D Mark II, I was done with third-party lenses. So I went out and got some L-Glass. I got the 400 millimeter f5.6, but on a crop sensor, that's 640 millimeters. Woo, still at 600 millimeters, but now with 10 frames per second. Come on, give me a call, somebody. A few months went by, no calls. But at this point, I had been walking around with a boat anchor around my neck for years, and it was starting to take its toll. Those 4, 5, 600 millimeter lenses, plus those camera bodies, really weighed me down around my neck. Now, all these years later, I can actually pop the vertebrae in my neck just by pressing, and I think it's because of all those years of carrying a camera around. 10 frames per second, and still no phone call. So what next? Gosh, it must be that I still don't have enough reach. So I sold the 400 millimeter f5.6 and bought another Tamron 150-600 millimeters. With that 1.6 times crop factor, I was over 900 millimeters. Man, that's wildlife gold. But of course, no phone call came, and I couldn't help but wonder why. Why am I not making images that are winning awards? Why am I not making images that are making me happy anymore? I thought that the most important thing in wildlife photography was having amazing gear. Tune into any channel, watching on YouTube, and everybody's got this incredible gear. 400 millimeter f2.8, 500 millimeter f4, 600 millimeter f4, 800 millimeter f5.6. These $10, $12, $15,000 lenses. That must be why I'm not getting a call. It's not because I don't have the right gear. It's because I don't have the cash to play with the big boys. That's got to be it, right? Apparently the Canadian snowbirds are arriving in Florida and they want to go birding. So I said, you know what? I'm going to take a different path. I'm going to go mirrorless, because at this point, mirrorless was just coming onto the scene as something new and sexy. So I sold everything I had, and I bought an Olympus EM5 Mark II and a crappy 75-300 millimeter kit lens that Olympus sells as well. I took that sucker everywhere, and for a long time, I was pretty happy. Yeah, it was small, it was light, it was fairly sharp, but the autofocus really drove me crazy. I had to use single point autofocus and press the shutter button really fast in a row just to track a moving bird. It certainly couldn't track in continuous autofocus like my DSLRs could, but it was smaller and lighter, so man, that was a big difference. But for some reason, the call of full frame started again when Sony released the A7, and then the A7R, and then the A7 II. Ooh, image body stabilization, just like my Olympus, but on full frame. I bet you that will be the key for me making the jump to professional wildlife photography. So I sold my Olympus and I bought an A7R II with the only lens that Sony had at the time that was long enough for wildlife photography, the 70 to 300 millimeter lens. Yep, I went from 900 and something millimeters with my Canon to a paltry 300 millimeters with the Sony. But it didn't matter. I had that sweet full frame and 42 megapixels. Man, oh man, there was going to be some detail in my bird pictures. But of course, as cartooners say, there's no replacement for displacement. So that 300 millimeter lens just wasn't cutting it. So what did I do? I went to eBay and I bought a Nikon 500 millimeter manual focus lens. So what if autofocus isn't great? I'll just manual focus, no problem. I can track a bird with manual focus. After all, they did it for years. And I did. I learned how to manually focus that lens. I could track a bird pretty well. I can get 1 out of 5 sharp. It was not too bad. I realized I loved the beautiful background blur that a 500 millimeter f4 gave me, and I loved the 42 megapixels of the A7R II. It was a really great combination, but there was just something lacking. I traded in joy for gear. Has anybody else experienced this? I really love shooting with my Olympus 75 to 300 and EM5 Mark II. Sure, the autofocus was a real pain in the neck, but around that, the camera was a joy to use. And keep in mind, during this time, I wasn't just shooting wildlife. I was also shooting things like nature, landscapes, and of course my second favorite photography, nightscape photography. And the Olympus really shined in those areas. But again, I heard the call of the full frame camera. So I sold it all and went to the A7R II. There's nothing wrong with Sony cameras. In fact, today I think Sony makes some of the very best cameras on the market. But to me, I just felt like the entire experience of shooting had become, quite honestly, a little bit soulless. I was in this desperate quest for displacement instead of looking for inspiration. Finally getting a little fed up with the entire manual focus experience and hearing just how incredible the user experience of Fuji lenses were, I figured, gee, I should probably switch to Fuji. That camera lens combination looks like cameras of old. It should inspire me and make me feel extra creative. But this time, instead of selling my Sony, I just bought an additional camera and lens. Yeah, I didn't have the money, so I borrowed it. I used some credit. And I got a brand new XH1 with the battery grip and the 100 to 400 millimeter lens that Fuji makes, along with a teleconverter. Initially, my love affair with that Fuji was endless. I was so happy. I felt like a pro at that big grip. I felt like I was getting really beautiful, sharp focus photos. After using manual focus for years, I was pretty pleased with the autofocus that the XH1 offered, and that 100 to 400 was really pretty sharp. And then I tried to use the Fuji menu system, and I spent more time banging my head against the wall than I did taking pictures. The autofocus system was complex, the menu system was complex, and I found that although I was getting sharper and better images than I was manually focusing, the keeper rate still wasn't high enough for me, and I still felt lost. It was around this time that I started experiencing crippling back spasms. Spasms so bad that if I had one, I was in bed for a week and could only walk with a cane. These were things that would send me to the doctors for shots of cortisone in my back, for pain medicine, muscle relaxers, and they were just simply ruining my life. Of course, weight and diet haven't helped. I could stand to lose some pounds and I could probably eat healthier, but I think a big contributing factor was all those years carrying lenses and cameras that were far too heavy for me in ways that were just not smart. It actually deeply upsets me when I think about all the money and time I've wasted chasing things like focal length, sensor size, and prestige, instead of chasing things that inspired me. And so here I am, years later, frustrated and in pain. But the story's not over. See, after Fuji was done and I was tired of that system, and after Sony was finished and I was tired of manually focusing, I went and I bought a Canon. Yep, another Canon. Because right then at the end of the year last year, Canon released the EOS R. I was actually excited about this camera. It was the first time in a long time that I picked up a camera and actually felt excited about it. I loved it. But I needed long glass. And what is full frame? Full-size glass. And that is a problem. For someone who has back spasms like I do and can't take too many steps the wrong way without injuring themselves, carrying around full frame glass, even with a mirrorless camera, really didn't help me get lighter and more nimble. But that being said, I still went out and bought my 500mm f4.5 like I started this video out with. It's sitting in the back of my car right now here at Merritt Island, and I'm walking around looking for photographs. People keep looking at me like there's something wrong with me. But I'm a wildlife photographer, so there's definitely something wrong with me. I was pretty happy with that combination of the EOS R and the 500 f4.5 for a little while. The images that I got in focus were super sharp, the background was really blurred, and because it didn't have image stabilization, that 500L lens was actually a little bit lighter than the newer 500 f4 lenses that Canon offers. But I started realizing pretty quickly when I went to places that required a hike, I wanted to carry my gimbal, and my tripod, and my 500, and a teleconverter, or two, and that became too much. So I convinced myself that instead of selling the 500 and selling the Canon EOS R, which I really loved, I would just buy the absolutely incredible 100-400 Mark II L lens. And it's an incredible lens, but as most wildlife photographers know, 400mm is really not quite long enough. So I found myself over and over again bolting on 1.4 or 2 times teleconverters, turning that f5.6 lens into an f8 or f11 lens. And yeah, I got a little bit more reach, 500 and something millimeters or 800 millimeters with the 2 times, but I lost a lot of light. And that really destroyed the advantages that full frame has to offer. Now, I love my 1.4 and my 2X. They definitely belong in my bag. The problem is losing all that light really makes it a challenge to get good sharp images. Fortunately, the 100-400 has excellent image stabilization. So instead of cranking the ISO, oftentimes I can just lower that shutter speed down to try and get good sharp shots. However, that doesn't help when birds move. Birds in flight really require a high shutter speed regardless of how good your image stabilization is. So all this was leading up to about a month ago. I decided to take a day off, drive to one of my favorite birding locations, Orlando Wetlands Park. It's about an hour drive from my house, and go on a hike to shoot some much needed bird photography. Especially with a young child, I haven't gotten out nearly as much as I like to in the past. I got to the site, packed up my gear, threw that 500mm f4 over my shoulder with the 2X teleconverter, put on my tripod with the gimbal head, and took a hike. I made it about 15 minutes into the park before my back started screaming bloody murder. In fact, I was so nervous that I quickly just stopped, rested for a minute, and went back to the car. I took almost no pictures after driving for nearly an hour. You see, I was alone, and I was afraid that if suddenly my back decided it was going to spasm, I was going to be left out there on this trail, all alone, not able to even get back to my car to get home for safety. And I was in a location where cell phone service is hard to come by, so I couldn't even dial 911 for help. It was a bad situation, and I was afraid that if I didn't get back to the car as soon as possible, I might get stuck out there for the day. Additionally, I had thoughts of having to leave my camera and lens behind and crawling to my car. Now, that's something that a 38-year-old doesn't often have to think about, but it certainly was crossing my mind as my back was getting really tight. So after taking maybe a dozen photos, I creeped back to my car, put my gear away, and drove home with my tail between my legs. I walked in, my wife asked me why I was home so early, and I just had this dejected look on my face. I think she knew right away something was wrong. My dream of having a big lens with a full frame camera had finally come true, and yet, with all of that being said, I could no longer carry it. It was like a great joke. So I said, okay, fine, I won't use the big lens anymore. I'll start carrying around that 100 to 400, and I'll sell the 500 f4, and that'll be fine. I'll just deal with 400 millimeters as being a minimum focal length. It'll be good enough. But pretty soon frustration set in. I couldn't get the birds I wanted with the framing I wanted, and I was having to crop crazy amounts just to have a bird that wasn't even filling the frame. And that really, really bothered me. I still had my 500 f4. I still had my 100 to 400 L lens. I still was in L heaven, if you would ask any Canon person. But I wasn't happy. Again, my gear wasn't making me happy. So I took a trip to a local Best Buy store that had a lot of cameras on display, and I played with a bunch of different brands: Sony, Olympus, Panasonic again, Fuji. I considered everything. Pretty much anything for me was on the table at that point because I was starting to get desperate. I didn't want my disability to start impacting the ability I had to take great wildlife photos. And I think that's what led me to here today. The adapted lens is about more than just cameras and lenses. It's about adapting to a situation that I think probably a lot of us go through at least one point in our lives or another. The ability to take pictures is so important to who I am as a person, and yet the disability in not being able to carry the gear I know is needed to take those great pictures is something that greatly frustrates me. So I did it again. I went online and I ordered a camera thinking finally maybe I had the solution to the problem. It's the camera I'm talking to you right now on, the little EOS M6 Mark II. I think it's an incredible camera. It's got fast autofocus, it's got an amazing frame rate, it's extremely versatile. There aren't a lot of lenses that are native to it, but let's face it, Canon's not going to spend a lot of energy making 500mm lenses for a camera system that almost nobody actually uses. So again, I knew I was going to have to adapt. I could adapt my 500 f4, but I wasn't going to save any weight that way. I could adapt the 100 to 400 L lens, and that probably was going to be the solution that was going to work the best. Got a drink. So just 24 hours ago, I called one of my good photography buddies up and said, hey, let's go out for a day of shooting. I got this new camera and I got a 100 to 400 lens that I think is going to work really well together. Let's go make some great images. So we took about a 2-hour drive to Lake Apopka Wildlife Drive. It's another amazing place for photographing birds here in Central Florida. And I had a great day of shooting. In fact, I came home last night and I told my wife it was a revelation. It was one of the best days I'd had in a long time. And yet, I ached. My back hurt. I woke up this morning pretty stiff. I was still sore from pushing myself harder than I probably should have, with a back that at any moment can decide, not today, and I'm going to spend a week in pain. So this morning when I woke up, I said, you know what? I'm going to go out shooting one more time. I'm going to start this video channel, and I'm going to tell my story, because I can't be the only person out there today feeling pain, feeling frustration, feeling anguish about not being able to do the thing that they love to do because of a disability. You're not alone. I know I'm not alone, and I want to share this experience together. So this was an awful long video for me to say, welcome, thanks for tuning in, and I hope together you and I can find a balance between good photography and good ergonomics. A healthy balance that allows us to take the photos we want without the pain that we so desperately want to avoid. I've shot every major system except for Pentax, although I wouldn't mind some Pentax gear, and Leica, because I'm not a doctor, and Hasselblad, because I've never walked on the moon. But I sure would like it if you would come with me on this journey, and hopefully together we could discover ways to have less pain and more pleasure in our photography. So thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. Bye for now.